Breathing, the master key to self-healing, begins with a lecture on the benefits of breathwork.
My name is Andrew Weil, and I'm going to talk to you about the healing power of breathing. I'm a medical doctor, and I direct the program in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona, where I'm training doctors of the future. Integrative medicine attempts to combine the best ideas and practices of conventional and alternative medicine, and to work from the premise that the body can heal itself if given a chance. We try to learn and teach about natural methods of promoting healing, including dietary change, stress reduction, use of herbal remedies, and so forth. And one of the main treatments that I teach physicians is to use the power of breath. This is new for many of them because medical education at the moment does not include information of this kind. Until this material is included in the conventional medical curriculum, and medical students and doctors in training are given the knowledge and then the experience that can make them see the power of this technique, they will be unable to recommend it to patients. In the 4 years I spent at Harvard Medical School and a year of internship in San Francisco, I learned nothing about the healing power of breath. I learned about the anatomy of the respiratory system. I learned about diseases of the respiratory tract, but I heard nothing about breath as the connection between the conscious and unconscious mind, or the doorway to control of the autonomic nervous system, or breath as a technique for controlling anxiety and regulating mental states, or the possibility that breath represents the movement of spirit in the body, and that breath work can be a primary means of raising spiritual awareness. All of these ideas I learned in other ways. First, by studying yoga, especially in the 1970s, when I first encountered the body of knowledge called Pranayama, which is working with energy or breath that comes from India, and later from working with osteopathic physicians, especially the late Dr. Robert Fulford, who lived in Tucson and was a master practitioner of cranial therapy. From spending time with him, I heard repeatedly that proper breathing was a master key to good health, and as I watched patients go through his office and experienced the kind of gentle manipulation that he did in order to correct breathing techniques, I saw many astonishing cures of common conditions, some of them very serious. I was very impressed at what I saw there. And those two experiences, working with yoga and working with osteopathic physicians, led me to investigate what was known about breathing, to begin experimenting with it myself, and then to begin recommending breathing techniques to patients. Over the years, I would say that of all the techniques that I've recommended to people for improving health, the single technique that I get most feedback about in a positive way is the breath work that I'm going to teach you in this program. I have consistently heard from patients that practicing these techniques have improved digestion, have improved circulation, have corrected irregular heartbeats, have helped people relax, have dealt successfully with insomnia, have helped people deal with panic disorder and other anxiety states. And over again, I'm impressed by the power of working with breath as a technique to correct problems of health, to improve general health. I feel very strongly as a result of these experiences that proper breathing is a master key to good health. I'm also very impressed with the fact that breath work is free, it requires no equipment, it's simple, and it's working with something that literally you have right under your nose and many of us never think to make use of. I recommend breath work to almost all patients that I see because in my experience, stress is a primary cause or an aggravating cause of most cases of illness. And even if people have diseases that clearly have organic physical causes, relaxation can nonetheless benefit them and help their body's healing system work better. And I think that all people in our culture can benefit from learning to relax. And lest we think that we have a monopoly on stress, I want to tell you a story that I think is very interesting. A few years ago, I had a medical student, a woman, very interesting character who now works in a Buddhist monastery in Nova Scotia. She had become very interested in third world peoples and native cultures and spent a lot of time doing rotations in far-off places before she got her MD degree. At one point, she went off for 6 months to a British field hospital in rural Kenya, where she was one of 4 doctors, serving an enormous population of tribal peoples that had no other access to medical care. She went there with very romantic notions of dealing with exotic infectious illnesses like African sleeping sickness. When she came back, she was very sobered by her experience and told me that 95% of what she saw in that field hospital were stress-related disorders, especially migraine headaches, chronic back and neck pain, and peptic ulcers, and that the most common drugs that she prescribed there were Tagamet and Valium. Tagamet is one of the acid suppressive drugs that's used to deal with ulcers and esophageal reflux. So I conclude from this that stress is not something that's unique to America in the late 20th century. I think that the forms of stress may differ in different parts of the world and other cultures, but I think that to be human is to experience stress. I don't think we can make stress disappear from our lives, but I think we can learn to process it better or to neutralize it so that it doesn't damage our bodies. Of all the techniques that I have investigated for reducing stress and increasing relaxation, it is breath work that I have found to be the most time efficient, the most cost efficient, and the one that most promotes increased wellness and optimal health. In addition, I think that working with the breath can be a very powerful technique to center the mind, to help you work more effectively, to help you deal with all of the challenges that life throws in your way every day, and to really turn your direction away from the material world toward the non-physical world. I'm very interested in where this knowledge came from. If you look around the world, you will find breath work emphasized in many different systems, from martial arts to forms of natural childbirth. And if you try to trace back where this information came from, it seems to me that all roads lead to ancient India. Somehow in ancient India, people discovered the power of breath as a technique for affecting the nervous system, for changing consciousness, and for changing physiology. And I think it's fair to say that that knowledge that came to ancient India has diffused all over the world and taken many different forms. In India, working with the breath is a major component of yoga. It's called pranayama, and the word prana means both breath and spirit and universal life energy. The techniques of pranayama have not been much written down. Often they've been passed on as oral teachings, often esoteric teachings from master to disciple. Occasionally you will find books in English that describe basic techniques of pranayama, and all of them begin with warnings about the dangers of working with breath without the supervision of an expert, a guru. The reasons being, they say, that working with breath can unleash very powerful forces and energies within the body that can unhinge the mind and cause extreme physiological disturbances. I think there may be something to that. I have actually seen a few patients who had first psychotic breaks following doing intensive breath work, unsupervised, So I think it is possible that some of these extreme techniques of pranayama may be dangerous and should not be done without supervision. But I want to tell you here and reassure you that the methods that I'm going to teach you I think are quite safe. These are modifications of pranayama techniques. They are methods that I use myself on a daily basis and have gotten great benefit from, methods that I have recommended to hundreds and hundreds of patients over several decades and have never seen cause problems. I also think that in a way these are very simple essences of some of the pranayama techniques. If you look in the few books on pranayama, you'll see many very complicated breath techniques given there. Alternate nostril breathing, for example, and strange forms of breathing that none of us would normally do. They may have their purposes. I'm not an expert in that field, but what I take from this are very simple methods that you can use to raise the energy of the nervous system, to quiet the energy of the nervous system, to balance the energy of the nervous system, and so forth, and to center the mind. And these are the applications of pranayama that I find most useful. As a medical doctor, I'm very interested in the physiological mechanisms by which breath work can accelerate healing. I think the most important physiological fact is that breathing is the only function that we do either completely consciously or completely unconsciously. There is no other function in the human body that has that aspect about it. You can breathe as a completely voluntary act, or you can breathe as a completely involuntary act. So that breathing is controlled by two different sets of nerves and muscles. There are voluntary nerves and muscles that can activate the system and operate it fully. There are involuntary nerves and muscles that can run the system and operate it fully. As a result, breath is the only function through which you can influence the involuntary nervous system. That is, you can establish rhythms of breathing with your voluntary nerves and muscles that will affect the involuntary nervous system. Imbalances of involuntary nervous system function underlie many common disorders. For example, high blood pressure has as its root overactive sympathetic tone. The sympathetic nervous system is one of two divisions of the involuntary nervous system. The involuntary nervous system is also called the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch prepares the body for fight or flight, for emergencies. It speeds up heart rate, it increases blood pressure, it slows down digestion, it diverts blood circulation away from the surface of the body to the interior. And this is a very logical response. If you're faced with an emergency, the thing that's most important is to maintain blood flow to the brain. If there's any failure in that, you're dead. So the reason the heart speeds up and that blood pressure increases and that blood is shunted away from the surface of the body is to ensure that there will be no interruption of blood flow to the brain. In the same way, the reason that digestion shuts down is that digestion becomes a non-essential function during an emergency as opposed to circulation, for example. The parasympathetic nervous system has exactly the opposite effects. It slows the heart rate, it lowers blood pressure, it increases blood flow to the skin and surface of the body, it increases movement of the digestive organs. Normally, these two systems work in balance, and there is a back and flow ebb of dominance of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system appropriate to the situation. But it appears that in many of us today, there is overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system. It's as if the body is reacting constantly to an external threat that never goes away. How we got in this situation, I'm not sure. Perhaps this is a consequence of the way we live today. That is, in very high population densities, with a great deal of emotional stress, with a great deal of noise that may have effect on our nervous system. At any rate, whatever the cause, there is in many people an imbalance in nervous system functioning in the direction of overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system and underactivity of the parasympathetic nervous system. This constant sympathetic stimulation can lead to high blood pressure or to disturbed heart function irregular heartbeats, for example, to cold hands because the skin is deprived of adequate blood. And these disturbances in circulatory function, digestive function, can in turn produce other imbalances in the body. I think there are many disorders that commonly come to doctors' offices which have as their root this kind of imbalance in the function of the autonomic nervous system. In medicine in the West, we don't yet really recognize this as a specific diagnosis, but I was very interested to find that in Japan, the diagnosis of autonomic nervous system imbalance is frequently used, and it's exactly this kind of imbalance that I have described. So it may be that this concept will catch on here among Western physicians as well. A problem is that the way that conventional Western medicine deals with these diseases is not very satisfactory, because instead of getting to the root of the problem, which is the imbalance in nervous system function, we attempt to block the overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system or to deal with its consequences at a more superficial level by giving drugs which are suppressive or counteractive. This is the way we deal with high blood pressure, for example. We give antihypertensive drugs, or for common digestive problems, if there's too much acid secretion in the stomach, we give drugs that block the production of acid. The problem with using this kind of counteractive or suppressive pharmacological intervention is that it increases the tendency of the body to rebound, to react against it. Anyone who has ever used a nose spray to open a clogged nose has observed this effect. Your nose is stuffed up, you spray a chemical in, and magically you can breathe again. But 4 hours later or 8 hours later, depending on which chemical you've sprayed in, there is a rebound effect. The blood vessels dilate and your nose is closed off worse than before. And it's very easy to get into a cycle of dependence on the drug in order to maintain normal function. And every time you attempt to get off, there's this sort of rebound. That's really the same problem that confronts us if we rely on pharmacological suppression of conditions which have as their root overactive sympathetic nervous system activity. The breath work that I'm going to describe to you, and especially the relaxing breath that I will teach you, works to increase parasympathetic tone. So it brings these two systems back in balance. And you can actually observe when people are doing this breath work that blood pressure falls, that heart rate slows, and so forth. So this is getting to the root of the problem. It goes directly to the imbalance in autonomic nervous system function and corrects it. Does not do so immediately. It does so over time as a result of gradual, repetitive input of the right sort of rhythms. But I think that this method of working, although the results may be slower to see, is much superior. Not only does it not have toxicity, it is not working in a suppressive or counteractive way. The results are long-lasting. They get better over time. And of course, they're completely free of the toxicity that is usually associated with pharmaceutical drugs. Because breathing can be a conscious act or an unconscious act, it spans those two worlds. Therefore, by focusing attention on breath and working with breath, you are opening the channels between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. There are many forms of psychotherapy that attempt to do that as well. Classical psychotherapy, which attempts to bring into consciousness through free association of words, for example, repressed memories or emotions, is attempting to gain access to that unconscious compartment. A very simple way to do that is by focusing on breath, so that when you begin to do breath work, you may find that you have greater recall of dreams, that you have easier access to altered states of consciousness, for example. And all this as a result of greater interchange between those two compartments, which in many of us are separate. In addition, breath is a connection between mind and body. because clearly breath has a mental component. You can experience breathing in your mind, and you also experience it in your body. So breath, again, spans those worlds of mind and body. It's a connection in that sense as well. And by doing breath work, you can harmonize the influence that the mind has on the body. It's perfectly possible that an even deeper root of the physiological disturbance that underlies excessive sympathetic nervous system tone is a mental disturbance. For example, that anxiety may cause the sympathetic nervous system to be overactive in the first place, so that the real root of that condition is in the mental compartment rather than the physical compartment. The medical treatments that are used for diseases that result from overactive sympathetic tone are all directed at the body. When you work with breath, you are really working in both spheres. And I think that's a superior method of dealing with those problems. Finally, I think that there is a very important lesson to be drawn from the fact that in many languages of the world, the words for breath and the word for spirit are the same. Now, that's certainly true in Sanskrit. Prana, as I mentioned earlier, means both breath and also spirit or universal energy. In Hebrew, the word is ruach. In Greek, pneuma. In Latin, spiritus. These words all have the same simultaneous meaning of breath and spirit. And we have some of that in English in the word respiration or conspiracy, which means breathing together. But I think in English we're at a bit of a disadvantage in that when we use the word breath, we do not immediately experience the linguistic connection which exists in those other languages. In addition, the mental component of breath is a sense of rhythmic expansion and contraction. And I think that connects us to every other living thing, because all living organisms breathe. So that same rhythm is at the center, at the heart of all life. But I think we can generalize it beyond living organisms, because expansion, contraction, alternation of a positive phase and a negative phase seem to me to be the essence of all creation, whether it's the alternation of the cycles of day and night, the changes of the seasons of the year, or even at the extremes of observation, the expansion and contraction of stars, or the oscillations of atoms and subatomic particles. So I think it's fair to say that the essence of breath, that is the oscillation between two poles, is what connects us with everything. And it is here again that I find the spiritual lesson of breath work to be most important. There's even an idea in yoga philosophy that resonates with modern cosmology, that there may be a sort of cosmic breath in the rhythmic expansion and contraction of the universe. That is, that as the universe expands to an extreme, eventually it will begin to contract back to concentration at one point, and then to initiate with another big bang, another exhalation, if you will. So here, I think, on a grand scale, is the universality of breath. I think it's no accident that in many systems of spiritual work, there is great emphasis placed on concentrating on the breath, or that breath is used as the focus of meditation. In a nutshell, I think it's fair to say that when you have your attention on your breath, it's in a safe place. It's like putting your consciousness in neutral. There are far worse places to have your attention, on your thoughts, for example, or on images in your mind. If you look at your own mental states and emotions, I think you'll find that when you feel upset or angry or fearful, you can often trace those emotions to particular thoughts or to images that have intruded on your consciousness. I don't think it's possible to stop thinking, except possibly in very advanced stages of meditation practice, or to stop the flow of images into the mind's eye. But you can learn to divert your attention from those. And the safest place to put attention is the breath. This is putting your consciousness in neutral. It's looking at a safe place. And I think it's for that reason that in so many systems of meditation, the breath is used as the first object of meditation. There is a belief that I have found in many cultures, for example, in Native American cultures and in some cultures of Asia, that life begins with the first breath and ends with the last breath. That is, during the stages of fetal development, spirit is not yet connected to the developing body, so that spirit may be hovering in the presence of a fetus or a newborn, but until the breath cycle begins, it is not linked to the physical body. That's a very interesting concept, and as I say, it crops up in cultures very diverse in different parts of the world. In Islamic cultures, there is a belief that Allah, before a person is born, allots a fixed number of breaths to that soul, and that when those breaths are used up, the person dies. That would be an argument for learning to slow down your breathing. I think it is also fair to say that when you turn your attention in the direction of breath, you are really looking at the spiritual pole of your existence. That breath is the animated, non-physical aspect of your being. So that when you look in the direction of breath, when you focus your attention on your breath, you are really looking at your spiritual self. You are looking at the movement of spirit in the body, of spirit in matter. It is the non-physical essence. Let me go on a little bit of a digression here about the meaning of the word spirit. There is another use of that word in English that's interesting. We call strong alcoholic drinks spirits. And I often enjoy asking audiences, why do you think we call substances like rum and scotch and vodka spirits? What is there about them? What is the connection there with that word? The original phrase from which that word comes was spirits of wine, which was an old term for brandy. Brandy comes from a Dutch word, brandewijn, that means burnt or heated wine. Brandy was the first product of distillation. Distillation was invented by Arabs long ago, was forgotten, and then reinvented by the Dutch, just in time to ship distilled liquors to their colonies. And the original purpose of distillation was to reduce the volume of wine by a great factor so that it could be put in barrels, loaded on ships, taken to other parts of the world with the idea that when you got there, you would add water back to get the concentration down to the level of wine. But when people tasted what was in the barrels, nobody waited to put water in at the other end, and suddenly the world was flooded with a new form of alcohol that was very difficult to control because it was so much stronger. Now, what is it about brandy that is the spirit of wine? I think that the meaning of that word is that you are concentrating the essence of wine. It is the aspect of wine that gives it its power. And that as you distill and concentrate, you are taking out of this material substance or concentrating the non-physical essence, which is where the power is. That if you keep on going in that direction, you get to less and less of material substance, but you are concentrating power in terms of power to affect you, for example, to affect your body and to affect your consciousness. That's a very interesting clue as to the meaning of spirit, and I think that it's possible to look at breath in relation to body in the same way that we could look at brandy in relation to wine, that breath represents the concentrated, distilled essence of being, and that it is non-physical. It is invisible, it does not have substance, but it's where the power is. And I think it is for that reason that so much emphasis is placed on paying attention to breathing, on working with breath as a spiritual technique, as a technique for raising spiritual awareness, for moving spiritual energy. I think if you do nothing other than pay attention to your breath today for a few seconds more than you did yesterday, you have increased your spiritual awareness. You have made spiritual progress. There are traditions from Asia which say that you can reach enlightenment by doing nothing other than paying attention to your breath. And I believe that's true. I think that really is the power of breath. It is the spiritual essence of human beings. When we look in that direction, we are doing spiritual work. I'd like to tell you a bit about how I use breath work in a practical way with patients. When patients tell me that they have problems that I think are related to overactivity or imbalance of the involuntary nervous system, I always teach them the basics of breath work. I encourage them to pay attention to their breath. I encourage them to change techniques of breathing. And I give them specific exercises, especially a relaxing breath, to help balance the energies of the nervous system. I usually teach patients these techniques at the end of the time that I have with them. I breathe with them, so I engage in conspiracy with patients for better health. And I then encourage them to practice these techniques on their own on a daily basis. I could give you many, many stories of successful outcomes that I've witnessed in patients who have used these methods. For example, I have seen many patients who have had irregular heartbeats, the common garden variety skip beats, which are really premature ventricular contractions, or more serious arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation. And in case after case, I have seen patients who have been able to stop these arrhythmias or greatly reduce their frequency just by relying on breathing techniques. One man who came to see me told me that he had had cold hands all of his life, went home and wrote me a month later saying that after he had started practicing the relaxing breath, within 3 days his hands became warm for the first time in his life. Cold hands, by the way, are a very obvious manifestation of overactive sympathetic activity, because in an emergency state, the sympathetic nervous system shuts down blood flow to the skin, where it's not essential, and shunts it to the center of the body, to internal organs and the brain especially, where it is essential. So a person who has an overactive sympathetic nervous system will often have cold hands in a warm room. And I think if I were just given a few seconds to ascertain something about a patient, the thing that I would probably do most would be to feel their hands, a great clue to the workings of the nervous system. Here's a dramatic story of the success of a breathing technique to correct a medical problem reported by Dr. Karen Koffler, one of the first class of fellows in integrative medicine to be graduated from the University of Arizona. Her relative and patient, a young man who was a trader on the Chicago stock market, he had episodes several times a year of a condition called atrial fibrillation, in which the upper chambers of the heart beat rapidly and irregularly, causing an unpleasant sensation and interfering with circulation throughout the body. Usually this condition is treated with drugs to slow the heart rate. The patient had an episode of atrial fibrillation during a holiday weekend, and my doctor, trainee, and colleague taught him the relaxing breath that you will learn in the course of this program. After he did it for about 5 minutes, the heart rate slowed and came out of atrial fibrillation, and the patient was able to avoid a visit to an emergency room. He has not had another episode since then, but now feels confident that if he does, he'll know what to do on his own before seeking medical help. This is a very dramatic example of the power of a simple breathing technique to affect a very real and potentially serious medical problem. I have seen many patients who had chronic digestive problems, indigestion, constipation, who as a result of doing breath work corrected those problems and were able to stop using prescribed medication. I've seen very dramatic cases of reduction of anxiety and ending of panic states by doing breath work. And let me tell you one case history here. Some years ago, a lawyer came to see me who lived on the East Coast, was very successful, whose life had come to a halt as a result of panic disorder, probably the most extreme form of anxiety disorder. His disease began very suddenly one night when he woke up with crushing chest pain, was taken to an emergency room of a hospital where everyone assumed he was having a heart attack until they did an electrocardiogram and found that his heart function was normal. He was kept for observation, given a dose of Valium, and sent home. Shortly afterwards, he had another of these episodes, and then they became more and more frequent, and in the following year, he had something like 50 or 60 admissions to emergency wards, always looking as if he were having a heart attack. That is, he experienced extreme crushing pain in his chest, extreme panic associated with that, feeling that he was about to die. Interestingly, his mother and sister had had the same disorder that began at the same age. And this, by the way, is a characteristic of panic disorder. It often has a strong familial component. He was absolutely convinced that something was wrong with him on a physical level, although all of the doctors he consulted told him that there wasn't. But he persisted in going around the country to an amazing range and number of specialists, had all sorts of invasive medical tests. Eventually, one of these tests indicated that he might have something wrong with the function of his esophagus, and he was put on a variety of medication to try to correct his digestive function. This produced no change in his panic attacks and caused him a lot of toxicity. It was recommended that he consult with a psychiatrist, which he was very reluctant to do. But finally, after test failed to show that he had a physical problem, he went to a psychiatrist. Psychotherapy also failed to touch this problem, and the only thing that controlled it was Valium. He quickly became dependent on Valium. Valium is an addictive sedative that interferes with mental function. He was taking a high dose of it and found that if he attempted to even cut the dose down, he had a full-blown attack, which resulted in his going to the hospital. And he further developed a symptom of agoraphobia, that is fear of open spaces, and became more and more confined to his house. He stopped working. This condition threatened to disrupt his marriage. He really became a prisoner of his own condition and was desperate. When I saw him, I reassured him that I thought nothing was wrong on a physical level that was not repairable, that this was a functional problem, that it was a disorder of function, and that if that could be corrected, there had been no permanent harm done to his physical organism. I told him that it was essential that he get off Valium because this was a suppressive medication that was not really getting to the root of the problem. And as with any suppressive medication, it increased the chance that when he stopped, that the problem would return. He understood that, but was very scared to attempt to change the dosage of the drug. I taught him the relaxing breath that I will teach you later, and told him that I thought that this method alone could eventually control his problem, but they would have to work at it for some time. I recommended using a natural calmative, the herb valerian, to see if he could use that to help himself wean off Valium. And I gave him some other general recommendations about his lifestyle. Over the next months, he kept in touch with me regularly, and the news was not good. Anytime he attempted to cut the dose of Valium, he had a full-blown panic attack. He did the breath work religiously, but found that it made no difference. I kept reassuring him that if he kept it up, eventually this would produce a change. It did, but it really took several years for the regular use of breath work to change the problem. But when it did so very successfully. He was eventually able to get off all medication, to resume his former life, and to abort any panic attacks that started by using breath work alone. So here's an example of this principle that this is a subtle technique, but very powerful one, but it takes time. It's regularity of use. This was as severe a case of panic disorder as I had ever dealt with. So I think any condition, however severe, really is susceptible to this kind of intervention. And I would also say that as a physician, based on my experience, that there is really nothing that is out of range of this technique. Really, wherever you've got nerves in your body, which is everywhere, you have the possibility of improving function by using breath as a technique of harmonizing the function of the nervous system. The very simplest form of breath work is doing nothing other than paying attention to your breath. That is, not trying to influence it, not trying to speed it up or slow it down, not trying to change the rhythm, simply looking at it, observing the breath. This is something that you can do anytime. You can do this while you're waiting in a line at a supermarket. You can do it while you're waiting at a stoplight in a car. You can do it if you're sitting listening to a lecture. Anything. You can look at your breath without trying to influence it. It's just taking a little break from the normal flow of thoughts, flow of images, flow of attention to external stimuli, and putting your mind briefly in a neutral place. And that's one of the techniques that I recommend to you. And I repeat here that if you will do that today for a second or two longer than you did yesterday, you will have made spiritual progress. One of the essential techniques that I distill from this body of knowledge about pranayama is that the qualities of breath that you want to develop are to make it deeper, slower, quieter, and more regular. Let me repeat those. You want to make your breath deeper, slower, quieter, and more regular. So whenever you think about it, whether you're driving in your car, whether you're waiting in an office, whether you're sitting watching a movie, whether you're at home eating dinner, if you think about it, try to make your breath deeper, slower, quieter, and more regular. And again, over time, if you keep doing that, your breath will change in that direction. When your breathing is deeper, slower, quieter, and more regular, you are feeling better in both mind and body. Your nervous system is functioning more smoothly, and all your organs are operating more harmoniously as a result. It's also interesting to observe people who are angry, afraid, or upset. And you will find that invariably in those states, breathing becomes rapid, shallow, irregular, and noisy. So this is a correlation that we can observe. That is, in states of mental upset or agitation, breathing is noisy, irregular, rapid, and shallow. Whereas in states of relaxation, harmony, breathing is deep, slow, quiet, and regular. And here is an illustration of how the voluntary aspect of breathing can be used to influence conditions which we normally don't think of as being directly under our control. That is, if you are upset, you can't always just tell yourself to settle down, but you can always change your breathing in the direction of making it deeper, slower, quieter, and more regular, and by doing so, you affect your physiology, both the body response and the mental state. There's another very interesting teaching in pranayama that has always caught my attention that has to do with the way we conceive of the breath cycle. No, if you think about it, breathing has no beginning and no end. It is a universal, continuous waveform of inhalation and exhalation. There's no point at which you can say that a breath cycle begins and a breath cycle ends. We arbitrarily impose a form on it in which we imagine that a breath cycle begins with an intake of breath and ends with an exhalation. But that's an arbitrary way of doing it. I found out that in the written language of China and Japan, the Chinese character for breath consists of two components, one meaning exhalation and one meaning inhalation, and the one for exhalation goes first. Now that, I think, embodied in that picture is a very interesting idea, and it's an idea that also comes from ancient India, which is that it is useful to conceptualize the breath cycle as beginning with an exhalation. One of the exercises that I'm going to teach you is called putting exhalation first. And this is the practical method of learning to change the way that you think of breath so that you imagine it beginning with exhalation and ending with inhalation. I think you'll be very surprised to find how different it is to breathe that way. The reason being that when you exhale, you have potentially much greater control over the volume of air that you move in and out, because the muscles that control exhalation are potentially much more powerful than the muscles that control inhalation. So that when you think of breathing in a different way, you can actually change how it works. Here's another general tip about breathing. When you take a deep breath, your belly should move outward. To find out whether this is happening, you can just put your hand on your abdomen. When you take a deep breath, does your hand move outward? Are you letting your belly expand? In order to take the fullest kind of breath, you have to do what's called abdominal breathing. For one reason or another, and this may have to do with how we've been taught to hold ourselves, it may have to do with the feeling of not wanting to feel big around the middle, but many of us don't let our abdomens expand freely when we breathe. We restrict those muscles and as a result are unable to take a full deep breath. So another general tip about breathing is to practice just taking some deep breaths and letting the belly move outward to see if that's what you're doing already. If not, to try to let it be that way. Because only when that movement occurs are you really taking the full volume of air into your lungs that you're capable of taking in. The other techniques that I'll be teaching you, I want you to do in a more formal way. That is, I'm going to give you particular ways of breathing that I want you to practice every day. You may wonder, is there an optimal time to do this? I think this practice can be done any time of day. Personally, I like to do breath work when I first get up, and I do it before I meditate. My usual practice is to arise early. I get up when it gets light. I do a few simple morning chores, and then I meditate. And before I sit down to meditate, I do a few minutes of breath work, and this seems to me a very natural time for doing it. I also do another session of breath work as I'm falling asleep at night. When I get to bed, I find that this promotes restful sleep. It disengages my consciousness from my thoughts, and I find that a very logical time to do it. And then I may do it as well if I have a special need for it. If, for example, something happens during the day that upsets me, if I stub my toe, anything where I want to distract my consciousness for a moment, I may do some of the breath work that I'm going to be teaching you. I think the amount of time that you spend on this work is not that important. The basic exercise that I'll be teaching you, you can do in a few minutes. And if you do this twice a day, that's more than adequate. But again, I'd like to remind you that what is important here is the regularity of doing this work. You want to do this every day without fail because you are attempting to change rhythms in your nervous system. And it's the constancy of the input, it's the regularity of the input that is going to produce these changes over time. If you've ever practiced yoga or watched yoga students doing pranayama, sometimes the breath work that's done there is very intensive. There's a lot of huffing and puffing and sweating as a result of doing these kinds of breathing exercises. That's not what I'm going to be asking you to do here. Rather, I think the power of breath work to change the function of the nervous system can be compared to the way water cuts a canyon through rock. It's the constant stimulus, the constant pressure that produces huge changes, so that what appears to be a very gentle force produces very large results. So find times in the day where this practice suits you, where it feels natural, logical, where you won't have interferences, and make a resolution to do it at those times. Before we move into the actual exercises, let me reassure you that this is very easy work, that it takes no time, no equipment. Even if you're someone who hates the idea of exercise or can't take time for things that you know are healthy, there really are few excuses for not doing this. I mean, this is going to take all of a few minutes a day. You'll enjoy it. It's not something that's difficult, and you will see results. I guarantee you that if you work with these techniques over the space of a few weeks or a few months, you will see real changes in your energy level, in your sleep patterns, in how your body functions, in your digestion, in your circulation, and so forth. So I think that of all the things you may have been told to do for health, you will find this to be some of the most easy and rewarding work possible, and certainly some of the least time-consuming. So I want to encourage you to undertake these techniques, to use them every day, and to pay attention to the changes that you'll see in your body and mind.